Anna, you asked me to come on today to talk a little bit about what is happening on the ground in the Senate in Washington as we speak with respect to our diplomatic efforts to try to change the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program, to make sure that they are committed in a verifiable way to a peaceful nuclear program and that they are divorced permanently from any pathway to a nuclear weapon. This is of vital importance, not just because it should scare us deeply that a rogue nation like Iran could possess a nuclear weapon, but it would set off a nuclear arms race in the Middle East if that were to happen. The good news is that through a series of crippling sanctions imposed by the United States in coordination with our allies, we have convinced the Iranian leadership to come to the table, sit across from the United States and our partners, which are commonly referred to as the P5+1, to attempt to find a peaceful solution by which Iran can have a civil nuclear program and the rest of the world can have an assurance that they have no means by which in the short run to break out of that civil program and get a nuclear weapon. I am sort of part of a new breed of progressives here in the Senate. I'm born after the Vietnam War was started, elected after the Iraq War had commenced. I'm an internationalist. I believe that the United States should play a constructive role in the world, but I think that we need to learn from our mistakes to realize the limits of military power, that as it turns out, it's not a very good instrument to try to change the political realities on the ground in places like the Middle East. That's why when you have an opportunity like this to solve a major international crisis through diplomacy, you should jump at the opportunity to do it. But as MoveOn knows well, there are a group of members here who are threatening to undermine these negotiations by passing new rounds of sanctions against the Iranians and the Iranian government that are specifically prohibited by the interim agreement that has formed the foundation of these negotiations. Now, we've seen the power of the progressive community already. There was a bill to impose new sanctions that the president opposed, that all of our partners opposed, that would have done grave damage to these negotiations. And it was MoveOn and other progressive groups that rallied to do what many thought was unthinkable: convince some of my colleagues, senators, who had signed on as co-sponsors of that law, to actually either take their names off of the bill or to come out in opposition of it getting a vote in the Senate. They did that because they were convinced by the power of your argument and your members' argument that they had taken the wrong position. And they changed their position, sometimes reversed their position because of your advocacy. So that's the power that you have to influence this going forward. I spent some time over at the White House today with Susan Rice and her team getting an update on these negotiations. We've extended the negotiations for another 7 months. There was significant demonstration in the last few days, in the last week of negotiations leading up to the November 24th deadline, original deadline, significant signs and shows of movement from the Iranians, that they are finally getting serious about coming to the table, such that our side believed that it was important to give another 7 months. We would gravely risk the goodwill that we've built up amongst the negotiating partners and the progress that we've made in the last several weeks if we were to pass another round of sanctions that would violate that agreement and frankly give evidence, give ammunition to the hardliners in Iran that the United States really isn't serious, that all we want to do is punish the Iranians. All we're trying to do is undermine the supreme leader to enact regime change, which is what many of the hardliners believe is our bottom line. And so we're at a critical moment. We need to support this last burst of negotiations moving into the spring and early summer of next year, and we need to resist attempts to try to undermine it with new sanctions. Now, the Republicans are going to run the United States Senate. There's no way around that next year. And so the number of votes are going to grow inevitably for this new round of sanctions, for a new piece of legislation that could undermine these negotiations. So it's more important than ever that we protect the gains that we made earlier this year and last year when MoveOn and other groups convinced Democratic members to stand strong with the president, to stand strong with diplomacy. And it's important that we also not give up on Republicans. I spoke to at least one Republican on the Senate floor today who came to me saying, I don't want to vote for the sanctions package. How do we work together to try to support these negotiations? And so there is a lot of work here to do to make sure that we get to a diplomatic solution when it comes to the future of Iran's nuclear program. Let me make one broader point and then turn it back to you, Anna. Right now, the most interesting foreign policy conversation that's happening in Washington, D.C. is happening between John McCain and Rand Paul, between a neoconservative interventionalist and an isolationist. As progressives, I think it's time that we assert a proactive foreign policy agenda that stands for what I think a lot of us believe to be the imperative of U.S. foreign policy going forward. Find ways to exercise smart diplomacy and smart influence in the world while leading with something other than the sword. And I just offer one example of how we can do this. This week, the World Food Program announced that it had effectively run out of money to supply food benefits to the hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees that are living in places like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, as well as the Syrians who are struggling to survive inside that conflict-ridden country. The response from the U.S. government was, well, we've put up a lot of money already, and so it's up to our partners, our other nations, to put up the rest of the money. And, you know, there's some truth to that. The U.S. has been the most generous donor to the World Food Program. We've certainly done our part, and other countries should step up to the plate. But it exposes a double standard of American foreign policy. When we launch a military campaign, we don't do just our part. We do whatever it takes. We allocate every dime necessary to carry out our military objective. Then we don't go try to find other partners who will fill in or help share the burden. But when it comes to humanitarian assistance, we're only willing to do our part. And if there's a gap, that's somebody else's fault. The reality is that the amount of money that it costs to fire 20-some-odd Tomahawk missiles on one day in September equals the amount of money that it would cost to continue to feed every single Syrian refugee living outside of that country for the rest of the year. And we just have to ask ourselves, what matters more to American security? What's more important? One day of missiles being fired at ISIS inside Syria, or being able to feed hundreds of thousands of hungry refugees who, if they don't get a square meal, if they aren't able to hold their lives together, are going to turn to ISIS, either as a source of cash or as a protector? I think the answer is pretty obvious. And so our broader debate here and our broader challenge is, how do we engage the progressive community to try to have a proactive answer to the neoconservatives and the isolationists, neither of which represent where we are. We need your help moving forward. Engage your members in the House and in the Senate. Engage your friends in your community to support the president in his push to end Iran's nuclear ambitions through diplomacy. It can be an example of how we organize around foreign policy and how we can set a new course in the world by which America leads, but we lead with diplomatic and economic power rather than with military power.